Hello, this is Father Louis SCURTI back with Friends of the Word. We thank you for joining us, and I know I opened with a smile. It's because I've met Nancy Faulch, who is very pleasant to speak with, and her ministry is so important. She works with bereavement groups, and she's a bereavement grief facilitator. We'll talk about that. And if you've seen the other program, the initial program, you found out that Nancy got into her experiences as a grief counselor being a person who was grieving in a group. You went through about 6 weeks of a grieving facilitation, a group with a sister in Wallington.
In Lincoln Park.
In Lincoln Park. And how did you meet that group? Because you're originally from West Milford and Wallington.
At the time, when I was looking for a group,
How did you know enough to look for a group? Did someone point?
the way that somebody told me about a group was my son needed a group.
Okay, because he was in college at that
Because he
time.
was in college at that time, and his counselor suggested he go to a bereavement group in South Jersey.
Good.
And he didn't want to go. So I said I would find one up here, and then we could compare notes with each other. So I asked one of my friends who was a nurse at Chilton Hospital if she knew of any.
Right.
And because I was attending church at the time, but I didn't hear of any here, and I didn't know churches had them at the time.
Good.
And she recommended the one in Lincoln Park that I went to.
Right. Was it called something? What was the name of it? Do you remember? Because sometimes they call it Lazarus Ministry.
As far as I know, it was called the Bereavement Support.
Bereavement support. Okay. So you had your experience of about 6 weeks.
Yes.
Where did the idea come from that you could or should become a grief support facilitator?
When my husband died, I didn't have a mass for him, and I felt guilty about that. And I was attending church, and there were 2 priests at the time at Queen of Peace, and I didn't know which priest to talk to. And a friend of mine, I said, which priest should I talk to? And they said, oh, Father Fred, he's so sweet, he's so nice, you should talk to him because he'll forgive you for, what you did. And so I said, okay, well, isn't there 2 priests here? And because Father Fred was Irish, he had an accent, it was a little hard for me to understand him. And she said, oh, Father Jamie. I said, okay. And so she didn't say anything. I said, well, I guess he's not sweet because you're not saying that.
Oh, wow.
And she said, well, he's nice, but he's streetwise. Do you know what that means, Nancy? And I looked at her, I said, I teach at Passaic High School.
Yeah, right, exactly.
I said, do you mean that he'll say exactly what he thinks, but he'll say it respectfully? Because that's what my students are like.
Yeah.
And she said, what a good description of him. Yes, that's
Excellent.
exactly
Love
what
the
he's
guy.
like.
I don't even know him, and I love him.
And so I was still undecided, but anyway, at Mass, they would give a Franciscan cross away at the end of Mass, and Father Jamie would say, is there anybody here visiting? And that's how they would determine who to give it to.
Right.
And there was somebody there from Passaic, and he said, oh, you're from Passaic? So am I. And I looked up to heaven, and I said, okay, God, I got it. I teach in Passaic.
Isn't that
This
great?
priest is from Passaic.
And it was Jamie.
And it was Father Jamie.
Isn't that great?
Yes. So I went to talk to him, and it was Christmas. It was during Advent. And I went to talk to him about the fact that I didn't have a mass for my husband, that I felt guilty about that. And he asked me what I was doing for myself to help myself. And I said, I went to a bereavement support group, and I go to Al-Anon. And he said, oh, well, Al-Anon's really good. And with the bereavement support group, why didn't you come here? And I said, because they don't have one at Queen of Peace. So I went down to Lincoln Park. And he looked at me and he said, well, maybe someday you could be a facilitator at one here, Nancy. And I was sobbing at
That's
the time.
the Holy Spirit
I
acting
know
through
who it
him.
was.
Oh, my Lord.
I know that now. I
Yes.
didn't know that then.
Good.
But anyway, so I was sobbing. And I looked at him, I said, not in a million years could I ever do that, Father. And 2 years later, with his encouragement and Father Zig's encouragement, who was at St. Joe's at the time,
Yes.
I went for training, and I've been doing groups ever since for the
That's
last 10
great.
years.
How long was your training?
I went for training twice. The first time I went, it was 2 weekends.
Okay.
So Saturday, 2 Saturdays,
Right.
all
right,
day.
Right.
And the second time I went, it was about the same amount of time. By that time, I had retired, so I was able to do it during the day, and I went to Newark, and it was a total of, I guess, 4 sessions that I went to.
Good.
Yes.
You must have been given literature to read on your own, because
Yes.
I'm sorry, 4 sessions is not enough
No,
for
they-
the importance of what
Right.
you do.
They gave me a lot of material. They gave me a booklet to follow, and I used many of the items that are in that booklet to give to my groups.
Great.
Yeah.
Okay, so you have is it certification or XYZ?
I do have 2 certificates.
Okay, name it something. Okay, so then you come back to your parish
Yes,
and offer your services?
and offer my services. So first I did it at St. Joe's
In Lincoln Park?
in West Milford.
That's another St. Joseph's, okay.
Yes, there's a St. Joseph's in West
They
Milford.
ran out of names, so they keep using
Yeah.
the same one over and over, okay.
No, and then I did it there. I was not doing it at Queen of Peace at the time. When I went for my first training, a woman that I know who also went for training, we agreed that she would do it here and I would do it at St. Joseph's.
Great.
So that's what, for the first about 5 years, that's what we did. I did it in the fall there, and she did it in the spring here.
So you come back and you introduce yourself to the pastor as certified
Yes.
support?
Oh, yes.
Okay.
And Father Zig knew I was certified. And then what happened, Father Zig was transferred to Rockaway.
Okay,
And so there were times when I would go to Mass there, and the couple that had been doing their bereavement support group, we would contact each other through emails, and then him and his wife had surgery and couldn't do it, so he asked me if I would sub for him for a year. And then once I started doing it there, I did it there for about 3 years, and also did it in West Milford. And then a couple of years ago, the person who was doing it here had surgery, and she asked me if I would fill in for her, and I did, and ever since I've done it,
and the rest is history.
she never got it back, because this is my ministry, and this is what I do.
It's so important. Before we continue that, I want to go back to your son. So did he go to a support group?
He did go to a support group, and we had just been talking about it recently, and I said, do you think it helped you? I had asked him that then, and he felt that it really didn't help him because he couldn't relate to the people who were there, because most of the people were there for the loss of, let's say, their spouse, not for the loss of a parent.
Right.
And he
right.
was young. He was
Yes.
like 22 when his dad died.
Sure.
So he didn't get as much out of it as I got out of it.
Okay. But he did attend and
He
try
did
to-
attend, yes.
Okay.
yes.
I think just being surrounded by people who mourn eventually clicks in. It doesn't matter who you mourn, because the love that you have for that person is the key.
Right.
And you can identify what they do, other people do, and how they process. But we'll talk about that. Okay, so you come back here to the parish and you offer your services. What was the first group that you ran like?
The first group I ran was small. I had, I think, 5 people in it. And I only offered it at that time to widows and widowers.
Okay,
I
interesting.
didn't make a general announcement because I felt I couldn't understand people who had lost their parents or people who had lost a child. Because even though I had lost my parent, my father was older, and I felt like, well, you lose your parents because you lose your parents because of their age.
Yeah.
That's a normal part of life.
Sure.
And I couldn't imagine losing a child, so I could not see having a parent there who had lost their child. In Rockaway, they did offer it to anybody who had suffered a loss. And I talked to the people, and he said, well, go back for training. If you don't understand,
Good.
they really explain that to you in training. And if
good.
you missed it the first time around, go back. And he was right.
Yes.
And I learned how to do that. It's not an easy thing to do.
No.
Without a doubt. If somebody's sitting there who has lost their spouse, or somebody's sitting there who has lost their child, you have to have them understand that they suffered a loss. and that even though it's a different loss, it's a loss.
It's a loss, yeah.
That somebody they're never gonna get back, somebody they're never gonna see again, and so they did teach me how to do it. Do I do it for young children? No, because I would have to go back
Young
to
children
training
who've
again.
passed.
Right,
So
young
the pa- you
children
don't
who
do it
are
for the
passed,
parents.
no.
Okay.
So when I get the names from the rectory of people who sign up for it, because they don't call me, I do a phone interview with them.
Good.
And if they tell me that they've lost their child and their child was 10 years old, I would recommend that they go to another group.
Great.
Because I haven't been trained in dealing with
Good.
a parent who has lost a young child.
So you're a facilitator. That's great. You
Right.
point the way. That's
But,
excellent.
but I do have people who have lost their children, but they're in their 20s or their 30s. And
Oh, the children.
the children that
are-
they
yeah,
lost,
yeah.
right.
So again, it's a certain clientele and
Right.
age group that you are more
Right.
comfortable with.
Yes.
And that's appropriate because that identification, I imagine, is really, really
Yes.
important for you
Right.
to be at ease as counselor. The first session when Father called you and
As a
asked-
facilitator.
as facilitator. I can't use counselor, sorry about that. So nix that out of your head. The first group you ran, how did you feel when you started it?
Actually, when I started it, I felt like it was too soon for me. When I walked out the first night, I cried all the way home. And I thought, oh, maybe I shouldn't be doing this because I should be able to control my emotions. And, but I went to church that Sunday, and Father Jamie was standing outside, and I just stood. He was talking to somebody, and I waited till he was done. And I walked up to him, and he said, you look like somebody hit you between your eyes.
Whoa.
And I says, well, that's sort of how I feel. He said, what's the matter? I said, I don't think I'm ready to do this. I really don't. And he said, why? And I said, because I ended up crying all the way home, and you know my history with crying. And he said, Nancy, it's okay to cry. How many times do I have to tell you it's okay to cry? And I said, well, you know, he said, do you remember why it's okay to cry? And I said, no. And at that point, I was crying.
Sure.
And he said, remember, Jesus cried for Lazarus. And I looked at him and I said, Father, I know who Jesus is, but who's Lazarus?
That's great. That's great. Good.
And I had been away from the church
Yeah,
that
I know.
long.
That's great.
And now every time Lazarus is mentioned, I think,
Go back to Father Jamie.
you know, I think, how could I have been so stupid? But anyway.
That's great. This has
Yes.
been Father Louis SCURTI interviewing Nancy Faulch, who is a coordinator of the local here at St. Our Lady Queen of Peace Church, facilitator of bereavement, and that's really, really a beautiful ministry. I'm so glad it's a layperson who's doing this. I know the original group you attended was a religious sister, but it's such an extension of ministry in the church that lay people take on such a significant role. So on behalf of everyone out there and other priests, I thank you because it's courageous and strong.
Welcome.
God bless you. This has been Father Lou with Nancy. Let me hear from you. FatherLouSCURTI@hotmail.com. And if you are in a situation where you've lost someone, contact your local parish or bereavement group and try to attend. I mean, I'm not going to tell you go, but try to attend just for the consolation and sharing that you will experience. God bless you.